This, my friends, is Sonoma by Track Brewing Company. And in my humble opinion, this is one of the best session pale ales that you can get in the UK today. For a long while, I've been trying to recreate this myself. And in this video, I'm going to take you through my latest attempt to do just that. So this is the road to Sonoma. So before we get into the recipe and the brew day and all of that jazz, I want to sing the praises of this beer a little bit more first of all. So what's so great about Sonoma? If you haven't tried it before, then what have you been doing? Like, you need to get this beer and give it a go. It's a hazy pale ale, and yes, they are basically all over the place nowadays. Everybody's doing them, but at 3.8% and a beer that's been around for a long time, this, I think, holds its own against pretty much anything else out there in the same sort of strength range. And for me, it's pretty much the quintessential kind of session American style pale ale that's being made in the UK at the moment by Track, who happen to be pretty much my favourite brewery as well. So it's a perfect marriage of Citra, Mosaic and Centennial hops, and the flavour and body in this beer really belies the low strength. So it's super sessionable at 3.8%. It's really nicely balanced, and it's just a really great tasting beer. So as I said, it's been something that I've been looking to try and recreate in a homebrew recipe for quite some time. I've not got to the point until now where I've really felt confident about putting out as a video where I've put the word Sonoma anywhere near the title of it. But this time round, I managed to get quite a bit of input from one of the actual brewers at Track. So big shout out to Matt Dutton for helping me out with some tips for this recipe. And we actually had him on the Hop Edition podcast. So if you are wanting to hear some more background information on how Track go about making their beers, including Sonoma, but also their other kind of styles as well, I highly recommend going and looking at that podcast, or listening to that podcast even, and I'll put a link to that in the description. So let's get into the recipe. Now, Matt did give me some really good pointers on this, and I know that some elements of it are pretty much bang on, but he didn't just give me the exact recipe. This was based on feedback that he gave based on what I told him about my clone version of it. So it's not the exact scaled down recipe from Track. It may still be a little bit of a work in progress in terms of getting it really fine tuned. And obviously, whenever you're trying to clone a beer, there's always going to be big differences in terms of how your equipment performs and all of that other stuff, which is going to affect the final outcome. So I generally don't really like using the term clone because of that. I always like to say it's more of a tribute to that recipe or beer style. But obviously, I am trying to get it as close to what Track do as possible. So first of all, batch volume. This was a 23 litre batch, and we were working from a 78% brewhouse efficiency. The target values for OG were 1046 and aiming for a final gravity of 1017, which you'll probably realise is pretty high. We'll get onto that in a bit when we talk about mash temperature. And IBUs pretty low at 23, but that's mainly related to the fact there are no boil hops in this recipe. And that's one of the things that I know for a fact is how they do it at Track, because that's what Matt told us. So those are the basic numbers that we're aiming for, and obviously 3.8% ABV is the target. I did come up a little bit short on that, but again, I'll talk about that more in a minute. So on the grain bill, we've got 3.5 kilos of extra pale malts from Crisp Maltings. We've got 500 grams of wheat malt and 300 grams of Caragold malt in the grain bill. As far as hopping goes, we've got Centennial and Citra and Mosaic in the hop stand. So there's no boil hops at all. This is all going in at the hop stand or Whirlpool edition. And I was doing this at 80 degrees centigrade. So after flame out, shutting down everything, chilling the work down to 80 degrees and whirlpooling, in this case for half an hour. So I extended the time a little bit to what I would normally do because there are no boil hops in there. So I wanted to try and get a little bit of the bitterness out of those as well. And from what Matt was saying in terms of how long the hops would actually be in contact with the hop wort at the commercial scale, it probably makes sense to extend the whirlpool time a little bit on the homebrew level as well. So we had 40 grams each of the Centennial and Citra and 20 grams of the Mosaic. That was one of the elements of the recipe that I think was fairly good from my original version anyway, because Matt seemed to think that the ratios there were pretty bang on, or at least close to what they do in the real thing. And then after that, it's just Mosaic in the dry hop, and we've got 140 grams of that. And my usual dry hopping schedule would be to do 2 or 3 days at 14 degrees. I think that Matt mentioned that at Track they do it a little bit warmer, so I think they dry hop at 18 if I remember correctly, but I wanted just to kind of stick with my usual method for that because it's always worked for me. So dry hopping at around 6 grams per litre is the sort of target rate there. Hop stand 30 minutes at ATC, and yeah, the IBUs come out fairly low on the base of that, but in the final beer I think it doesn't taste as sweet as you might imagine it would do with that sort of boogoo ratio that you end up with. So yeah, that is the grain bill and hop schedule. Then we need to talk about the yeast and mashing temperature and the water profile as well. Okay, so let's start off with that water profile. Now, I didn't get an exact set of figures for what Track are working with, but I know that certainly for the canned and the keg version of Sonoma, it is a high chloride to sulfate ratio, as you'd probably expect with this sort of beer. So starting with RO water, the numbers that I went with on the water profile were 100 ppm of calcium, 6 ppm of magnesium, 155 of chloride, and 61 of sulfate. In order to achieve that, adding all of my salts in with the mash, I had 2 grams of gypsum, 10 grams of calcium chloride, 2 grams of Epsom salt, and just a little dash of phosphoric acid to bring the pH down to around 5.3. Targeted anyway, so 0.7 mils of phosphoric that worked out to for me. So that was the water, and one of the other key points that came out of our discussion with Matt is that Track use very high mash temperatures quite a lot. Most people know that their sort of house yeast is London Ale free, but what a lot of people might not know is that they're also, with a lot of their beers, especially Sonoma and the kind of table beers that they do, they're using very high mash temperatures. So in this case, 72 degrees C, which is a bit above pretty much anything that I'd done before as far as mash temperature goes. And that's obviously to enable you to give a very high sort of starting, not very high, but a higher original gravity, but not finishing so low that it still ends up at a high ABV. So you keep the session strength, but there is enough unfermentable sugars left in the wort to give it a little bit of body and stop it becoming too thin or dry, I suppose. So yeah, London Ale free is the yeast, and that's a fantastic yeast all round anyway, and I can totally see why it's used as their house yeast, because it's worked really well in all sorts of styles for me. But nowadays a lot of people especially are using it for kind of hazy IPAs and pale ales and things like that as well. A lot of people say the origin of that is the Boddington's brewery, which is obviously from Manchester as well, which is where Track are from. And I actually used a dried version of this. So I was using saturated yeast by WHC, and yeah, supposedly that's a dried version of the London Ale free, and a lot of smaller craft breweries are now actually using that as well. I think Jack from Baron, who was also on the podcast, was telling us that he's been using that saturated yeast quite a lot. So how did the brew actually go itself? It was all pretty good. The only issues that I had were my numbers were a bit out. I basically undershot a little bit on the gravity. I normally set the brew house efficiency a little bit higher for lower ABV or lower gravity beers, because I would normally find that I get better efficiency when there's more sparge water to go through, and that would normally be the case, but on this occasion I ended up with a slightly lower efficiency, and my original gravity was a few points down, but then strangely the final gravity was still pretty high. Now, I had a few issues when I was mashing in. I made this beer on one of the coldest days of the year, and it was absolutely freezing out in the garage, and I did have to kind of keep adding hot water into the mash tun to try and keep the temperatures up, because even though I've got a big insulated mash tun, the temperature did keep dropping down pretty quickly. And again, I would have expected that to maybe make the mash come out a little bit more fermentable, but maybe the fact that I kept adding hot water to it had the opposite effect, and it went the other way. So I didn't quite get the 3.8% I was aiming for. It ended up at 3.4%. But other than that, it seems to be pretty much on the money, or, well, we'll see if it's on the money in a bit when we do the tasting. So yeah, that's the recipe. There will be a link in the description to that for the Brewfather file, so do feel free to go and check that out, or download it or whatever if you want to. There's only one thing to do now, which is obviously taste it and see if it's any good and how it compares to the real deal. So here we have the big reveal. On the right hand side here we have the real deal. This is Track's original Sonoma here, and this is my version, or Road to Sonoma as I am now calling it. And I think the first thing we can say is colour wise we are not too far away at all. In fact, I think it's a pretty good match. The only thing that's slightly throwing it off here is that the kind of haze that stayed in suspension in this canned version of the original is a little bit more than what we've got in my kegged version. So it seems like more of the yeast and other goodies that are in there have kind of settled out in my one, whereas in the canned one it seems to have retained a little bit more of that. So this one is a bit more murky. You can see a little bit more. It's still obviously pretty hazy, but you can see a little bit more through this glass over here. So taking that into account, and if you kind of look at the bottom of the glass in particular, I think the colour is very, very close. It just doesn't look quite as close as it does because this one is a little bit more opaque. So anyway, aside from that, got a nice little frothy cap on both of them. I poured the can out first, so that one has dropped away slightly more, and the keg version is fairly lively, so it generated quite a bit of froth on that one as well. I think you can actually see a little bit more carbonation perhaps in that one than in the real thing. So yeah, that's how they look. Let's get on to the important bit, which is the aroma and of course the taste test. Okay, so just to give you a slightly different view for the colour, don't know if that makes any difference, but yeah, they do still look pretty close to me, from this angle anyway. Right, so let's look at aroma first of all on these. It's all mosaic dry hop, so we should be expecting that kind of dank mosaic, mango-y, kind of maybe slightly sweaty aroma that you get from mosaic hops, which is quite distinctive. And yeah, the aroma off of my version, that is all mosaic basically. It's very nice, definitely a nice hint of mango in there. And I've got to say, compared to the original, it's very similar. I'd probably say, if anything, this one has got a little bit more of a brighter kind of aroma to it. Now, this can was bought just before Christmas. We're early January now. They're normally turning out Sonoma pretty quickly, but so it should be reasonably fresh. This one has been in the keg for 3 weeks now, so it's probably a bit younger than the canned version. And don't get me wrong, the aroma off of the real thing is very nice as always. I think there's just a little bit more juicy mosaic kind of aroma coming off of my version. So yeah, aroma is very similar, but perhaps just a little bit brighter on the homebrew version. I mean, if I was drinking this and not knowing that it was an attempt at Sonoma, I've got to say I'm really happy, because I think I'd say straight away that tastes like Sonoma basically. So the first impressions are really good. It's kind of light, but still a decent mouthfeel and body to it, especially for, I mean, this is an even lower ABV beer, this one, so this is 3.4% it came out at. but it's still got a nice mouthfeel to it. It's got nice sort of juicy tropical fruit flavour in there again, that kind of mangoey taste to it, a little bit of melon. Yeah, really nice soft tropical fruit. I think the Centennial and the Citra just bring in a little bit of citrusy, maybe piney flavour there as well. Now, let's compare it to the real thing. I've got to say, it's pretty close. Yeah, same sort of flavours really. It's slightly different. I think maybe this does taste a touch fuller, sort of in the mouthfeel. That might obviously be because the ABV is a little bit different. I've got to say, I think flavour-wise, maybe this one is also a little bit brighter on the flavour. So perhaps freshness-wise, this one is just winning out a little bit. That might be sort of slightly skewing the, any differences between the flavours as well. But overall, the flavour profile, it's super close. It really is. I mean, it's still great. This is, yeah, again, I think maybe I'm getting a little bit more of the Citra coming through on this one. So there's a little bit more of that kind of soft papaya, slightly peachy, soft fruits, and yeah, just nice kind of slightly grapefruit thing. Again, a little bit of the Centennial coming through on that front. So this is without a doubt as close as I've come to recreating the real thing in a homebrew level. And to be honest, I think the freshness of this one at the moment is probably, as far as my preference, making me edge towards the clone or tribute attempt of it at the moment. I'd like to, I'd love to put it up against the sort of fresh off the line can of Sonoma to make it a true comparison, as it were. But the flavor profile and the aroma and everything is really, really close. It's worked out really well. So I've got to say a massive thank you to Matt Dunn for helping me out with the recipe for this. And yeah, I think if I sort of get my brew day numbers on point and get everything a little bit closer on that front, I'm pretty close to pretty much where I want to be as far as my own version of Sonoma, or Road to Sonoma as I'm calling it. So yeah, I recommend you do give this a go if you like to if you'd like to try and recreate Sonoma at home. This is my best attempt at the recipe so far. There are various other versions of it floating around out there on the internet, and I have taken inspiration from some of those in the past and they've worked pretty well, but this is my best attempt so far. So cheers everyone, gonna enjoy drinking the rest of this.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, that or his dudeness, or duder, or El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.